In the heart of London, behind the gilded gates of Kensington Palace, a decision was about to be made that would shake the very foundations of royal protocol. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood in her private study, her hands trembling as she held a letter that could end her royal life as she knew it. Outside her window, the world continued its daily rhythm, unaware that within these ancient walls a modern princess was about to choose love over duty, compassion over tradition, and her own moral compass over centuries of established protocol. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Persian rug beneath her feet, but Catherine barely noticed. Her mind was racing through the consequences of what she was about to do. Palace security had made their position crystal clear, the Queen's private secretary had issued stern warnings, and even her own protection officers had expressed serious concerns. Yet here she was, preparing to defy them all. What drives a woman who has everything to risk it all? What force could be so powerful that it would make someone willing to challenge an institution that has stood for over 1,000 years? The answer lay not in the glittering tiaras or state dinners that defined her public life, but in a simple truth that had been gnawing at her conscience for months. This is the story of how Princess Catherine's unwavering moral courage led her to make a choice that would forever change not just her own destiny, but the very nature of modern monarchy itself. Catherine Elizabeth Middleton had never imagined that her Tuesday morning would begin with a phone call that would challenge everything she believed about duty, family, and the role she had accepted when she married Prince William. As she sat in her private sitting room at Kensington Palace, watching her children George, Charlotte, and Louis finish their breakfast before school, her personal secretary knocked gently on the door. "Your Royal Highness," Maria Gonzalez said softly, "there's an urgent call from the Homeless Action Coalition. They say it's about the Stirling Street situation." Catherine's heart immediately began to race. Stirling Street was more than just another royal patronage to her. It was where she had first truly understood the devastating impact of homelessness on families, where she had met Sarah Thompson, a single mother of 3, who had been living in her car for 6 months after losing her job during the pandemic. That meeting had changed Catherine's perspective entirely. The voice on the other end of the phone belonged to David Mitchell, the coalition's director, and his words sent a chill down Catherine's spine. "Your Royal Highness, I'm calling because we've received word that Stirling Street emergency housing is being shut down today. The landlord has sold the building to developers, and they're forcing immediate evacuation. We have 47 families, including 18 children, who will be on the streets within hours." Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. She had been working tirelessly for months to secure permanent funding for the Stirling Street facility. The families there weren't just statistics to her anymore. She knew their names, their stories, their children's faces. There was Michael, the war veteran, struggling with PTSD, who had finally found stability there. Chen, who had been caring for her disabled grandson since her daughter's death. These weren't nameless faces in a charity brochure. They were real people whose lives would be shattered if they lost this sanctuary. "David," she said firmly, "what would it take to stop this? What are our options?" "Well, Your Royal Highness, the only option at this point would be an emergency intervention. The coalition could potentially secure temporary funding, but we would need someone of significant influence to personally guarantee the negotiations with the developers. Someone who could buy us time and bring media attention to the situation. But I understand that this kind of direct involvement might not be possible within royal protocol," Catherine finished for him. She understood exactly what he wasn't saying. The royal family operated within strict boundaries when it came to direct intervention in political and business matters. They could lend their names to causes, attend charity events, and raise awareness. But actually inserting themselves into emergency situations was traditionally forbidden. After ending the call, Catherine sat in her chair for several long minutes, staring out at the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace. The irony wasn't lost on her. She lived in one of the most beautiful homes in the world, surrounded by luxury and security. While less than 10 miles away, families she had grown to care deeply about were facing immediate homelessness. She thought about her own children, safely eating breakfast in their warm kitchen, preparing for another day at their prestigious school. What if circumstances had been different? What if she had been Sarah Thompson, struggling to keep her children safe and fed? The thought made her stomach turn. William had already left early for a series of royal engagements in Scotland, and she knew he wouldn't be reachable for hours. This decision would have to be hers alone. Catherine walked to her private study and pulled out the thick binder of royal protocols that governed her official activities. She had read through these guidelines countless times during her preparation for royal life, But now she was looking for something different. She was looking for loopholes, for exceptions, for any way she could justify what her heart was telling her to do. The protocols were clear and uncompromising. Members of the royal family were not to engage in direct intervention in private business disputes. They were not to use their position to influence commercial transactions. They were not to put themselves in situations that could be perceived as political advocacy. Everything about what Catherine was considering would violate these established rules. Her personal protection officer, Detective Inspector James Morrison, appeared in her doorway as if he had sensed her internal struggle. Morrison had been with Catherine for 3 years, and she had come to trust his judgment completely. He was a quiet man in his late 40s, a former military police officer, who had joined the Royal Protection Unit after serving 2 tours in Afghanistan. More importantly, he was a father of 2 young daughters, and Catherine had seen the way his expression changed whenever they visited facilities like Stirling Street. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said carefully, "I've been monitoring some unusual communications this morning. There seems to be increased media attention around the Stirling Street situation. I wanted you to be aware that if you were considering any kind of public response to this situation, it would likely attract significant scrutiny." Catherine looked at him directly. Morrison was not just warning her about media attention. He was giving her the opening to discuss what she was thinking. "Inspector Morrison," she said slowly, "what would you do if your daughters were among the families facing eviction today?" Morrison's jaw tightened slightly, and Catherine knew she had hit the mark. "Your Royal Highness, as a father, I would do whatever was necessary to protect my children. But as your protection officer, I have to advise you that any direct intervention would create serious security concerns and would likely result in significant backlash from the palace administration." "And if I decided to go anyway?" Catherine asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "Then I would ensure your safety, as always, Your Royal Highness. That's my job, regardless of the circumstances." Catherine felt a wave of gratitude toward this man who understood that sometimes duty meant more than following rules. She picked up her phone and called her private secretary back into the room. Maria Gonzalez had been with Catherine since shortly after her marriage to William, and she had become much more than an employee. She was a confidant, a cultural bridge, and someone who had never failed to speak honestly about difficult situations. "Maria," Catherine said, "I need you to contact the Stirling Street facility directly. Tell them that I will be arriving within the hour to personally assess the situation and to meet with the developers. I want you to also contact the media office and let them know that I will be making an unscheduled public appearance." Maria's eyes widened slightly. "Your Royal Highness, should I clear this with the private secretary's office first? This type of immediate response typically requires advance approval from—" "No," Catherine said firmly. "This is my decision, and I'm making it now. I need you to trust me on this." Maria nodded slowly. Catherine could see the concern in her expression, but also something else. Respect. "Of course, Your Royal Highness." "Should I arrange for additional security?" "Inspector Morrison will handle security arrangements. What I need from you is to make sure that when I arrive at Stirling Street, I'm prepared to have substantive conversations with everyone involved. I want to know about the developers, the timeline, the legal options, and the immediate needs of the families. I don't want to show up for a photo opportunity. I want to show up ready to solve problems." As Maria left to make the necessary arrangements, Catherine returned to her study and pulled out a different folder, one she kept locked in her desk drawer. This folder contained her personal notes from every visit to Stirling Street, every conversation with families, every idea she had developed for addressing homelessness in a meaningful way. She had been quietly working on a comprehensive proposal for months, something that went far beyond traditional royal patronage. Her plan involved working directly with developers, local government, and financial institutions to create a sustainable model for emergency housing that could be replicated across the country. It was ambitious, it was unconventional, and it was exactly the kind of direct involvement that royal protocol discouraged. But as Catherine reviewed her notes, she realized that today might be the perfect opportunity to test whether her ideas could work in the real world. The phone rang again, and this time it was Sir Edward Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary, and Catherine's stomach dropped. Sir Edward was the epitome of traditional royal protocol, a man who had served the crown for over 2 decades and who viewed any deviation from established procedures as a personal affront. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Edward's voice was crisp and formal, "I've just been informed of some concerning communications from your office regarding an unscheduled public appearance. I trust there has been some misunderstanding." Catherine took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. Sir Edward, there has been no misunderstanding. I am personally responding to an emergency situation involving families under my patronage. I believe this falls within my duties as the Princess of Wales. Your Royal Highness, with all due respect, this type of direct intervention is highly irregular and potentially problematic. The royal family does not involve itself in private business disputes or property matters. I must strongly advise against this course of action. Sir Edward, Catherine said, feeling her resolve strengthen with each word. These families are not a business dispute to me. They are real people facing a real crisis, and I have the ability to help them. I understand your concerns about protocol, but I believe that sometimes our duty to the people we serve must take precedence over administrative convenience. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sir Edward spoke again, his voice carried a tone of warning. Your Royal Highness, I must inform you that proceeding with this action without proper authorization could result in serious consequences. The Queen will need to be briefed, and there will likely be significant questions about your judgment and your understanding of your role within the institution. Catherine felt a flash of anger. Sir Edward, my understanding of my role is that I serve the British people, particularly those who are most vulnerable. If helping families avoid homelessness conflicts with institutional preferences, then perhaps it's the institution that needs to reconsider its priorities. After ending the call, Catherine realized that she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had essentially told the Queen's private secretary that she was willing to defy direct orders in order to follow her conscience. The implications of this decision would ripple far beyond today's events. But as she looked out her window again, watching her own children play safely in their garden, she knew she had made the right choice. In 30 minutes, she would leave the safety and comfort of Kensington Palace to walk into a situation that could define not just her future as a royal, but her identity as a person. The Stirling Street families were counting on her, and for the first time in her royal life, Catherine was ready to risk everything to ensure she didn't let them down. The drive from Kensington Palace to Stirling Street normally took 25 minutes, but Catherine found herself wishing it would last longer. With each mile, she knew she was moving further away from the protected world of royal protocol and closer to a confrontation that could change everything. Inspector Morrison sat in the passenger seat, occasionally speaking quietly into his radio, coordinating with the advanced security team that had been hastily assembled. Your Royal Highness? Morrison said, turning to face her. The situation on the ground is more complex than we initially understood. The developers have brought their own security team, and there are already several news crews gathering. The families are currently assembled in the main hall of the facility, and they're understandably very distressed. Catherine nodded, trying to process the reality of what she was walking into. This wasn't a carefully choreographed royal visit with predetermined talking points and managed interactions. This was a genuine crisis unfolding in real time, and she was about to insert herself directly into the middle of it. As their car turned onto Stirling Street, Catherine could see the scene developing before her. The emergency housing facility was a converted Victorian warehouse that had been transformed into temporary accommodations for families in need. It wasn't beautiful, but it had become a lifeline for dozens of people who had nowhere else to turn. Now, parked outside were several large trucks with the logo of Meridian Development Corporation, along with uniformed security guards who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the growing crowd of onlookers. The moment Catherine's car pulled up, she could see the shift in energy. The small crowd of residents, activists, and media representatives suddenly focused their attention on her arrival. Through the car window, she could see familiar faces among the residents, people she had met during her previous visits, people who had shared their stories and their hopes with her. Sarah Thompson was standing near the entrance, holding her youngest daughter, Emma, who was only 4 years old. Sarah's face showed a mixture of relief and desperate hope as she recognized Catherine's car. Next to her stood Michael Rodriguez, the veteran who had struggled with PTSD and had found stability at Stirling Street after years of sleeping rough. Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. As Catherine stepped out of the car, she was immediately approached by a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Richard Blackwood, the chief representative for Meridian Development Corporation. Blackwood was in his 50s, with perfectly styled grey hair and the kind of confident demeanor that came from years of successful business negotiations. Your Royal Highness, Blackwood said, offering a slight bow. This is certainly an unexpected development. I understand you have some interest in this property situation, but I want to assure you that Meridian is operating completely within our legal rights. The purchase of this building was completed months ago, and the residents have been given appropriate notice. Catherine looked directly at Blackwood, and she could see that he was already calculating how to manage this situation to his advantage. The presence of a royal family member could be either a significant complication or a powerful endorsement, depending on how the conversation proceeded. Mr. Blackwood. Catherine replied, her voice steady and clear. I'm here because I'm personally invested in the welfare of these families. Before we discuss legal rights and property transactions, I'd like to understand what options might exist to avoid displacing vulnerable people, including children and elderly residents. Blackwood's expression shifted slightly. He had clearly expected a more formal, diplomatic exchange. Your Royal Highness, I appreciate your concern for these individuals, but this is fundamentally a business matter. Meridian has invested significant resources in acquiring this property, and we have firm timelines for our development project. Delaying the eviction would create substantial financial complications. Catherine felt a familiar feeling rising in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced when she first visited Stirling Street and truly understood the human cost of homelessness. It was a combination of anger and determination that had been growing stronger with each visit, each story, each face she encountered. Blackwood, she said, stepping closer to him. What would it cost Meridian to delay this eviction for 30 days, while we work together to find alternative arrangements for these families? Blackwood looked surprised by the directness of the question.
Your Royal Highness, it's not simply a matter of cost.
We have contractual obligations, construction schedules, financing arrangements. I understand that you have business considerations, Catherine interrupted, but I'm asking for a specific number. What would 30 days cost your company? The small crowd had grown quiet, and Catherine could feel dozens of eyes focused on this exchange. The media representatives were clearly capturing every word, and she knew that this conversation would be analyzed and dissected by royal commentators and business reporters alike. Blackwood hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of this negotiation. Your Royal Highness, with respect, these are complex commercial matters that aren't typically discussed in. Mr. Blackwood, Catherine said firmly. There are 18 children who will be sleeping in cars or on the street tonight if we can't find a solution. I'm not asking you to discuss complex commercial matters. I'm asking you to tell me what it would cost to give these families 30 more days to find safe housing. For a moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Catherine realized that she was doing something unprecedented. She was using her royal platform not just to raise awareness or express sympathy, but to directly negotiate on behalf of people in crisis. Every principle of royal protocol suggested that she should step back, express general support, and leave the actual problem-solving to others. Instead, she stepped forward. Blackwood glanced around at the crowd, clearly recognizing that he was in an impossible position. Refusing to engage with a member of the royal family in front of cameras and desperate families would create a public relations nightmare for his company. But agreeing to negotiate in this public forum would set a precedent that could complicate every future development project. Your Royal Highness, he said carefully, perhaps we could continue this conversation in a more private setting?
Catherine shook her head. Mr. Aubert.
Blackwood, these families deserve to hear directly what options are available to them. They've been living with uncertainty for months, and they have a right to understand what's happening to their homes. At this point, David Mitchell from the Homeless Action Coalition stepped forward. Catherine could see the amazement in his eyes as he realized what she was attempting to do. Your Royal Highness, David said, if I may provide some context, we've calculated that temporary alternative housing for all 47 families would cost approximately £50,000 per month. That would give us time to work with local authorities to find permanent solutions. Catherine turned back to Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, would Meridian be willing to contribute to that temporary housing cost in exchange for a smoother transition timeline? Blackwood's discomfort was evident now. Your Royal Highness, Meridian is not in the business of providing social services. We're a development company with responsibilities to our investors and stakeholders. I understand that, Catherine said, but you're also a company that operates in communities and benefits from public support and government cooperation. Surely there's value in being seen as a responsible corporate partner rather than a company that displaces vulnerable families.
The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of additional vehicles.
Catherine recognized the distinctive car of Sir Edward Pemberton, along with 2 additional security vehicles. Her heart sank as she realized that the palace had decided to intervene directly in the situation. Sir Edward emerged from his car with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. His face was impassive, but Catherine could see the tension in his jaw. He approached the group with the kind of formal bearing that immediately commanded attention. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Edward said, offering a precise bow. "I believe there may be some confusion about the appropriate protocols for this situation. Perhaps we could have a brief private conversation." Catherine felt a moment of panic. She knew that if she stepped aside for a private conversation with Sir Edward, she would likely be convinced or ordered to withdraw from the situation. The families watching this exchange would see her retreat into the protected bubble of royal privilege, leaving them to face their crisis alone. "Sir Edward," Catherine said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "I appreciate your concern, but I am in the middle of a productive conversation with Mr. Blackwood about potential solutions for these families. I'd prefer to see this through before addressing any administrative concerns." Sir Edward's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but Catherine caught the flash of surprise in his eyes. She had just publicly refused a direct intervention from the Queen's representative, and everyone present understood the significance of that moment. Sarah Thompson stepped forward, carrying her daughter Emma. The little girl was wearing a worn pink dress and clutching a stuffed elephant that had clearly seen better days. Sarah's voice was quiet but clear as she addressed Catherine. "Your Royal Highness," Sarah said, "I just want you to know that what you're doing here today means everything to us. Not just because you might be able to help us find housing, but because you're treating us like real people whose lives matter. Most of the time, we feel invisible." Catherine felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. This was exactly why she had been willing to risk everything to be here. These families weren't statistics or charity cases to her. They were real people with real stories, and they deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. "Sarah," Catherine said, reaching out to touch Emma's hand, "you and Emma, and all the other families here, are not invisible to me. You never have been, and you never will be." Blackwood cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the negotiation. "Your Royal Highness, given the complexity of this situation and the unusual nature of these discussions, perhaps Meridian could consider a brief delay while all parties explore alternative arrangements." Catherine felt a surge of hope. "Mr.
Blackwood, are you saying that Meridian would be willing to postpone the eviction?"
I'm saying that we might be willing to discuss a short-term delay, perhaps a week or two, while more appropriate channels explore solutions.
Mr. Blackwood, with respect, a week or two isn't sufficient time to arrange alternative housing for 47 families. We would need at least 30 days to coordinate with local authorities and housing associations. Catherine could see Blackwood calculating his options. The media attention, the royal presence, and the obvious sympathy of the crowd had created a situation where refusing to compromise would be extremely costly from a public relations perspective. "Perhaps," Blackwood said slowly, "we could discuss a 30-day extension, with the understanding that all parties would work diligently to ensure a smooth transition by the end of that period." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Catherine felt a wave of relief and accomplishment, but she also knew that this was only the first step in a much larger battle. She had successfully negotiated a temporary reprieve, but she had also openly defied royal protocol and challenged the authority of the palace administration. As the crowd began to disperse and families started returning to the facility to share the news with others, Catherine found herself face-to-face with Sir Edward Pemberton. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense the storm that was about to come. The private conversation that Sir Edward Pemberton requested took place in a small office within the Stirling Street facility, away from the media attention and the celebrating families. Catherine sat across from the Queen's private secretary, with Inspector Morrison standing discreetly by the door. The tension in the room was palpable, and Catherine knew that the next few minutes would determine the trajectory of her future as a working member of the royal family. Sir Edward opened a leather portfolio and removed several documents, placing them methodically on the small table between them. His movements were precise and deliberate, the actions of a man who had conducted hundreds of difficult conversations during his decades of service to the crown.
"Your Royal Highness," Sir Edward began, his voice measured and formal, "what occurred outside today represents a fundamental departure from established protocols that have governed royal conduct for generations.
I need you to understand the implications of your actions both for yourself and for the institution you represent." Catherine looked directly at Sir Edward, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite the gravity of the situation. "Sir Edward, I understand that my approach today was unconventional, but the results speak for themselves. 47 families now have 30 days to find stable housing, instead of being forced onto the street today. Surely that outcome justifies some flexibility in our approach. Sir Edward's expression remained unchanged. Your Royal Highness, the immediate outcome, while admirable in its humanitarian intent, is not the primary concern. The concern is precedent. By engaging in direct negotiation with commercial entities, by inserting yourself into private business disputes, and by refusing guidance from the palace administration, you have created expectations and established patterns that could fundamentally alter the role of the monarchy in British society.
Catherine felt a flash of frustration.
Sir Edward, with all due respect, perhaps it's time for the role of the monarchy to evolve. We live in the 21st century, and people expect their institutions to be responsive, engaged, and willing to take meaningful action when faced with human suffering. Your Royal Highness, Sir Edward replied, the monarchy's power and influence derive precisely from its position above immediate political and commercial concerns. The moment we become direct participants in day-to-day disputes, we lose the moral authority that comes from impartiality. We become just another political actor, subject to the same scrutiny and criticism as elected officials. Catherine leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. But what good is moral authority if it's never used to actually help people? What's the point of influence if it's never deployed to address real problems? These families don't need our impartiality, Sir Edward. They need our action. Sir Edward pulled out his phone and showed Catherine the screen. Your Royal Highness, in the last hour, your actions here have generated over 10,000 social media posts, 15 news articles, and coverage on every major British news network. The headlines range from Princess Catherine breaks royal protocol for homeless families to Kate's constitutional crisis. This level of attention and controversy is precisely what royal protocol is designed to avoid. Catherine looked at the phone screen, scrolling through some of the coverage. The response was indeed massive, but as she read through the comments and articles, she noticed something that Sir Edward hadn't mentioned. The public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. People were praising her for taking action, for showing genuine leadership, for proving that the royal family could be more than ceremonial figureheads. Sir Edward, she said, handing back his phone, I'm seeing a lot of support in these responses. People seem to appreciate seeing a royal family member willing to take concrete action to help people in crisis. Public approval is not the measure of appropriate royal conduct, Sir Edward replied firmly. Popular opinion is fickle and unpredictable. The monarchy's stability depends on consistency, tradition, and respect for constitutional boundaries. What happens when your next intervention is less popular? What happens when you're forced to choose between competing interests? What happens when politicians begin expecting royal intervention in every controversial issue? Catherine was quiet for a moment, considering Sir Edward's points. She understood the concerns he was raising, but she also felt strongly that they represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what modern leadership required. Sir Edward, she said finally, I appreciate the complexity of these constitutional questions, but I can't accept that protecting institutional stability is more important than protecting vulnerable families. If my actions today create expectations that the royal family will be more actively engaged in addressing social problems, then I think those are good expectations to create. At this point, Inspector Morrison stepped forward. If I may, he said quietly, there's been a development outside that you should both be aware of. While you've been speaking, approximately 50 additional families have arrived at the facility. Word of the princess's intervention has spread through the homeless community, and people are hoping that additional housing solutions might be found. Catherine's heart sank. She realized that her successful negotiation with Meridian Development had indeed created expectations that extended far beyond the original Stirling Street families. People across London who were struggling with housing insecurity were now looking to her for help that she wasn't sure she could provide. Sir Edward looked at Catherine with an expression that conveyed both concern and a hint of vindication. Your Royal Highness, this is precisely what I was referring to. Your actions, while well-intentioned, have created a situation where you're now seen as the solution to London's housing crisis. How do you propose to manage these expectations? Catherine stood up and walked to the small window that overlooked the street. Outside, she could see the additional families that Inspector Morrison had mentioned. There were elderly couples, single mothers with children, young men who looked like they hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. The sight broke her heart, but it also strengthened her resolve. Sir Edward, she said, turning back to face him, you're right that I can't solve London's housing crisis single-handedly. But I can use my platform to bring attention to the issue, to pressure government officials and business leaders to take action, and to demonstrate that solutions are possible when people work together. And when the government accuses you of overstepping your constitutional role, When opposition politicians demand that you withdraw from political issues? When business leaders refuse to negotiate because they don't want to set precedents for royal intervention? Catherine took a deep breath. These were all legitimate concerns, but they also represented exactly the kind of institutional thinking that she believed was preventing real progress on critical issues. Sir Edward, may I ask you a personal question? Sir Edward looked surprised but nodded. Do you have grandchildren? I do, Your Royal Highness. 2 grandchildren. And if your grandchildren were among the families facing eviction today, what would you want me to do? Would you want me to follow protocol, or would you want me to do whatever was necessary to ensure they had safe housing? Sir Edward was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. Your Royal Highness, the question is not what I would want as a grandfather. The question is what the constitutional monarchy requires as an institution. But those 2 things don't have to be in conflict, Catherine insisted. We can be an institution that serves the people while also being people who care about individual human beings. We can follow constitutional principles while also adapting to modern realities. At this point, Catherine's phone buzzed with a text message from Prince William. She glanced at it quickly and saw that he had been briefed on the situation and was cutting short his engagements in Scotland to return to London immediately. The message simply said, "Saw the news, flying back now. We'll figure this out together." Catherine felt a wave of relief at William's support, but she also knew that his return would add another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. As the future king, William had even more constraints on his ability to engage in controversial activities, but he also had more influence when he chose to use it. Sir Edward's phone rang, and after a brief conversation, he turned back to Catherine with a grave expression. Your Royal Highness, that was Buckingham Palace. Her Majesty has requested a private audience with you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Catherine felt her stomach drop. A private audience with the Queen about today's events was exactly what she had been dreading. Queen Elizabeth was not just her grandmother-in-law, she was the embodiment of royal duty and constitutional propriety. The Queen had lived through decades of royal scandals and crises, and she had always maintained that the monarchy's survival depended on its members understanding and respecting their constitutional limitations. Sir Edward, Catherine said, what should I expect from that conversation? Your Royal Highness, I think you should expect Her Majesty to be very concerned about the precedent you've set today, and very interested in ensuring that similar situations don't arise in the future. Catherine nodded, understanding the implicit warning. The Queen would likely give her a choice, conform to traditional royal protocols, or face consequences that could include the restriction of her official duties, the loss of her patronages, or even more serious measures. As they prepared to leave the Stirling Street facility, Catherine took one last look at the families gathered in the main hall. Sarah Thompson approached her with little Emma, who was now smiling and seemed much less anxious than she had been that morning. Your Royal Highness, Sarah said, I know you took a big risk for us today. I want you to know that whatever happens next, we'll never forget that you saw us as real people worth fighting for. Catherine knelt down to Emma's level and smiled at the little girl. Emma, I want you to remember that you and your mummy are important, and there are people working to make sure you always have a safe place to live. Emma nodded solemnly and handed Catherine a small drawing she had made while the adults were talking. It showed a stick-figure woman in a blue dress standing next to a house with several other stick figures. At the top, in wobbly 4-year-old handwriting, it said, Thank you, Princess Kate. Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes as she accepted the drawing. This small gesture from a 4-year-old girl represented everything she had been trying to accomplish. Emma saw her not as a distant royal figure, but as someone who had helped her family in a time of need. As Catherine's car pulled away from Stirling Street, she realized that there was no going back. She had crossed a line today that would define the rest of her royal career and possibly the future of the monarchy itself. Tomorrow's meeting with the Queen would determine whether her defiance of protocol would be tolerated or punished, but regardless of the consequences, Catherine knew she had made the right choice. The drive back to Kensington Palace gave her time to think about the conversation she would need to have with William when he returned from Scotland. She would need to explain not just what she had done, but why she believed it was necessary, and what she thought it meant for their future roles as working royals. Most importantly, she would need to convince him that sometimes the most loyal thing you can do for an institution is to push it to evolve. Prince William's return to Kensington Palace that evening created a whirlwind of activity that Catherine had rarely experienced in their private home. The normally peaceful atmosphere of their family residence was disrupted by urgent phone calls, hastily arranged meetings, and the constant presence of additional security personnel. William had spent the entire flight from Scotland reviewing media coverage of Catherine's actions and consulting with his own advisors about the implications of what had occurred. Catherine was in the nursery, helping Charlotte with her homework when William arrived. The sight of him in the doorway, still wearing his formal daywear from his Scottish engagements but with his tie loosened and his hair slightly dishevelled from the rushed journey, reminded her of how much their lives had changed since their early days of marriage. Then, their biggest concerns had been managing media attention and learning royal protocols. Now, they were facing questions about the fundamental nature of their roles and the future direction of the monarchy. "Daddy!" Charlotte exclaimed, running to embrace William. The innocence and joy in their daughter's voice provided a stark contrast to the gravity of the adult concerns that surrounded them. William hugged Charlotte tightly, and Catherine could see him consciously shifting from the worried royal heir to the loving father. "Hello, darling," he said softly. "Have you been helping Mummy today?" "Mummy went to help some families who didn't have homes," Charlotte said matter-of-factly. "She said it's important to help people who need help." William's eyes met Catherine's over their daughter's head, and she could see both concern and pride in his expression. Even their 8-year-old daughter had understood the fundamental principle behind Catherine's actions, even if she couldn't grasp the political complexities involved. After ensuring that all 3 children were settled with their evening routines, William and Catherine retreated to his private study for the conversation they both knew was necessary. The room was lined with books on constitutional law, royal history, and political philosophy, reminders of the weight of the institution they represented and would one day lead. "Catherine," William began, settling into the chair across from her, "I need to understand exactly what happened today, not just the version I've been getting from the media and the palace staff." Catherine took a deep breath and walked William through the entire day, from the early morning phone call about the Stirling Street eviction to her final conversation with Sir Edward Pemberton. She explained her reasoning, her emotions, and her conviction that direct action had been necessary to protect vulnerable families. William listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad. Catherine could see him processing not just the facts of what had occurred, but the broader implications for their future roles and the institution they would one day represent. "Catherine," William said when she had finished, "I understand why you felt compelled to act, and I admire your courage in standing up for these families. But I need you to understand that what you've done today has created a constitutional crisis that extends far beyond the Stirling Street situation." Catherine felt a flash of defensiveness. "William, I refuse to accept that helping homeless families constitutes a constitutional crisis. If our constitutional role prevents us from taking action to help people in desperate situations, then maybe our constitutional role needs to change."
William leaned forward, his voice gentle but serious.
"Catherine, it's not that simple. The monarchy's position in British government depends on a delicate balance between influence and neutrality. The moment we start taking direct action in political or commercial disputes, we become political actors subject to all the constraints and criticisms that come with that role." "But William," Catherine replied, "we're already political actors. Every patronage we accept, every cause we support, every public statement we make has political implications. The difference is that today I used our political influence to actually accomplish something concrete, instead of just raising awareness." William was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the competing principles involved. Catherine could see that he understood, and even sympathized with her position, but she could also see the weight of his future responsibilities as king pressing down on him. "Catherine," he said finally, "what you did today was brave and compassionate, but it was also dangerous, not just for us personally, but for the entire institution. If we become known as the royals who intervene directly in business disputes, every controversial issue in the country will become our responsibility. We'll be expected to take positions on everything from corporate mergers to local planning disputes." Catherine stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where their children had played safely that morning, while other children faced the prospect of homelessness. "William, I understand those concerns, but I can't accept that protecting institutional neutrality is more important than protecting real people from real harm." At that moment, William's private secretary knocked on the door and entered with an urgent message. "Sir," he said, addressing William formally, "I've just received word that the Prime Minister's office has requested a meeting tomorrow afternoon to discuss today's events. Additionally, the leader of the opposition has issued a statement questioning the constitutional propriety of royal intervention in commercial matters."
Catherine felt her heart sink.
She had known that her actions would have political ramifications, but seeing them play out in real time was sobering. The last thing she wanted was to create political difficulties for William or to damage the monarchy's relationship with the government. After the private secretary left, William turned back to Catherine with a grave expression. "Catherine, this is exactly what I was concerned about. We're now being drawn into partisan political debates about our role and our actions. Both the government and the opposition are positioning themselves around what you did today." "What are they saying?" Catherine asked. William consulted his notes from the conversation with his secretary. "The Prime Minister apparently wants to discuss appropriate boundaries for royal engagement in social issues, which is diplomatic language for telling us to stay in our lane. The opposition leader is calling for clear guidelines on royal intervention in private business matters, which is political speak for criticising the government's relationship with the monarchy." Catherine sank back into her chair, beginning to understand the broader implications of her actions. "William, I never intended to create political problems. I just wanted to help those families." "I know you didn't intend it," William said softly, "but intent doesn't matter in constitutional matters. What matters is precedent and consequence." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine's phone, which had been buzzing constantly throughout the evening with messages and calls. This time, it was a call from her father, Michael Middleton, whose voice conveyed both pride and concern. "Catherine," her father said, "I've been watching the news coverage of what you did today, and I want you to know that your mother and I are proud of you for standing up for those families. But I'm also worried about what this might mean for you and for William." Catherine appreciated her father's support, but she could hear the underlying concern in his voice. Her parents had always been supportive of her royal role, but they had also witnessed firsthand the pressures and constraints that came with it.
"Dad," Catherine said, "I know there will be consequences, but I couldn't watch those families be evicted without trying to help them."
"Catherine, I understand that, and I respect your decision. But I want you to be prepared for whatever comes next. The media attention alone is going to be intense, and there will likely be people who criticize your actions regardless of how noble your intentions were." After ending the call with her father, Catherine and William sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. The weight of their situation was becoming clear to both of them. Catherine's actions had been successful in the immediate term. 47 families had been given 30 days to find alternative housing. But they had also opened questions about the role of the monarchy that could have lasting implications. "William," Catherine said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. If you had been in my position today, if you had received that phone call about the Stirling Street families, what would you have done?" William was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with the question. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Catherine, as your husband and as someone who loves you, I would have wanted to do exactly what you did. As the future king, I would have felt obligated to follow protocol and work through official channels, even if it meant those families spent tonight on the street." Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes. "William, how do we reconcile those two things? How do we be good people and good royals when those two roles sometimes conflict?" "I don't know," William admitted. "I've been wrestling with that question my entire life, and I don't think there are easy answers." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Morrison, who appeared at the study door with an urgent expression. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said, "I'm afraid there's been a development at Stirling Street that you need to know about." Catherine's heart immediately began racing. "What kind of development?" "About an hour ago, a group of approximately 200 people gathered outside the facility to show support for the princess's actions today. The gathering has been peaceful, but it's attracted additional media attention and has created some security concerns." William looked at Catherine with a mixture of concern and resignation. "Catherine, this is what I was worried about. Your actions today have created expectations and generated responses that are beyond our ability to control or manage." Catherine stood up, her mind racing. "Inspector Morrison, are the families at Stirling Street safe? Has the gathering created any problems for them?" "The families are safe, Your Royal Highness, but the situation is complicated. Many of the people who have gathered are homeless themselves, and they're hoping that your intervention today represents a broader commitment to addressing housing issues. There are also housing activists, social workers, and local politicians who want to capitalize on the attention your actions have generated." Catherine realized that her successful negotiation with Meridian Development had indeed opened a door that she wasn't sure she was prepared to walk through. The Stirling Street families had been just the beginning of what could become a much larger and more complex engagement with homelessness and housing policy. "William," she said, turning back to her husband, I understand your concerns about constitutional boundaries and political implications, but I can't ignore what's happening. These people are looking to us for leadership on an issue that affects thousands of families across the country. William nodded slowly. Catherine, I'm beginning to understand that today was not just about Stirling Street.
You're talking about a fundamental shift in how we engage with social issues, aren't you?
Yes, Catherine said, her voice gaining strength.
I'm talking about using our platform not just to raise awareness, but to drive actual solutions. I'm talking about being willing to take risks and face criticism if it means making a real difference in people's lives.
As they prepared to end their conversation and join their children for their evening routine, William took Catherine's hand.
Catherine, whatever happens tomorrow with the Queen, whatever political consequences we face, whatever changes this brings to our roles, I want you to know that I support you.
Not because I think your approach was perfect, but because I think your heart is in the right place, and because I think the monarchy needs people who are willing to push boundaries when it matters. Catherine felt a wave of relief and gratitude. Having William's support didn't eliminate the challenges they would face, but it meant they would face them together. As they walked upstairs to say goodnight to their children, Catherine realized that tomorrow's meeting with the Queen would not just be about defending her actions at Stirling Street. It would be about defining the future of the monarchy and her place within it. The morning of Catherine's audience with the Queen dawned grey and drizzly, matching the sombre mood at Kensington Palace. Catherine had slept poorly, her mind racing through possible scenarios for the conversation that would likely determine her future as a working member of the royal family. She had awakened at 5:30, unable to return to sleep, and had spent the early morning hours reviewing notes from her previous visits to Stirling Street and thinking through how to articulate her position to the Queen. The drive to Buckingham Palace felt longer than usual, despite Inspector Morrison taking the most direct route. Catherine wore a navy blue dress suit that she had chosen specifically for its conservative formality, hoping to convey respect for the institution even as she prepared to defend actions that challenged its traditional boundaries. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed her talking points one final time, but her resolve remained firm. Queen Elizabeth received Catherine in her private sitting room, a space that was both magnificent and surprisingly intimate. The Queen was seated in her customary chair, wearing a pale grey dress and her signature pearls. Her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes alert and focused. At 99 years old, the Queen had witnessed and navigated countless royal crises, and Catherine knew she was about to be subjected to a level of scrutiny that few people ever experienced. Catherine, the Queen said, her voice carrying the crisp formality that had characterized her public speech for over 7 decades, please sit down. I believe we have several important matters to discuss. Catherine took her seat across from the Queen, maintaining eye contact while feeling acutely aware of the historical weight of the moment. She was about to defend actions that violated centuries of established protocol to a woman who embodied the very essence of royal tradition and constitutional propriety. Your Majesty, Catherine began, I want to acknowledge from the outset that my actions yesterday were unconventional and that I understand they have created concerns about protocol and precedent. The Queen studied Catherine for several long moments before responding. Catherine, what concerns me is not simply that your actions were unconventional. What concerns me is that they suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of the monarchy in British society and government. Catherine felt her heart rate increase, but she forced herself to respond thoughtfully. Your Majesty, I would respectfully suggest that my actions reflect a different understanding of our role, rather than a misunderstanding. I believe that the monarchy's relevance in the modern world depends on our willingness to engage meaningfully with the challenges facing the people we serve. The Queen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and Catherine could see that her response had surprised the monarch. Throughout her long reign, the Queen had rarely been challenged so directly on fundamental questions about the nature of royal duty. Catherine, the Queen said, the monarchy's survival through centuries of political and social upheaval has depended on our ability to remain above immediate controversies while providing stability and continuity. The moment we become direct participants in daily political and commercial disputes, we lose the unique position that allows us to serve as a unifying force for the nation.
Catherine leaned forward slightly, her voice gaining confidence.
Your Majesty, I understand that perspective, but I would ask you to consider whether our traditional approach is still relevant to the challenges we face today.
The families at Stirling Street weren't asking for stability and continuity. They were asking for immediate help to avoid becoming homeless. The Queen was quiet for several minutes, clearly considering Catherine's words carefully. When she spoke again, her tone was less formal than before. Catherine, tell me about these families. Tell me about the individuals who were facing eviction yesterday. Catherine felt a surge of hope at this opening. Your Majesty, there's a woman named Sarah Thompson who has 3 young children and has been living in her car for months after losing her job during the pandemic. There's a veteran named Michael Rodriguez who struggled with PTSD and finally found stability at Stirling Street after years of sleeping rough. There's an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen who is caring for her disabled grandson after her daughter's death. As Catherine described each family, she could see the Queen listening intently, her expression softening slightly. Catherine realized that the Queen, despite her formal role and constitutional constraints, was still a grandmother and a human being who could understand the human cost of homelessness. Your Majesty, Catherine continued, when I stood outside Stirling Street yesterday and watched a 4-year-old girl clinging to her mother because she was afraid they would have to sleep in their car again, I couldn't think about constitutional boundaries or political implications. I could only think about doing whatever was in my power to help that child and her family. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see her wrestling with competing principles and emotions. When she spoke, her voice was gentler than Catherine had ever heard it. Catherine, I understand the compassion that motivated your actions, and I respect the genuine concern you feel for these families. But I need you to understand that individual acts of compassion, however noble, cannot become the basis for royal policy without careful consideration of broader implications. Catherine nodded, understanding the Queen's point but not accepting it as definitive. Your Majesty, what if individual acts of compassion could become the foundation for more systematic approaches to social problems? What if yesterday's intervention at Stirling Street was the beginning of a broader royal engagement with housing policy and homelessness prevention? The Queen's eyebrows rose slightly at this suggestion. Catherine, are you proposing that the royal family should take on direct policy roles in social welfare? I'm proposing that we should use our unique position and influence to drive solutions rather than simply raising awareness, Catherine replied. We have access to business leaders, government officials, and community organizations that most people could never reach. We have the ability to bring parties together, to create pressure for action, and to hold people accountable for results. The Queen considered this for several minutes before responding. Catherine, what you're describing sounds remarkably similar to political leadership. How do you propose to maintain the monarchy's constitutional neutrality while engaging in the kind of advocacy and pressure that effective policy work requires? Catherine had anticipated this question, and she had given it considerable thought during her sleepless night. Your Majesty, I believe there's a difference between partisan political activity and non-partisan problem-solving. Addressing homelessness isn't a conservative or liberal issue. It's a human issue that affects people across the political spectrum. Our role would be to bring people together around shared values and practical solutions, not to advance particular political ideologies. The Queen seemed intrigued by this distinction. Catherine, can you give me a specific example of how this approach might work in practice? Catherine felt a rush of excitement as she realized the Queen was genuinely engaging with her ideas rather than simply rejecting them. Your Majesty, imagine if we convened a series of working groups that brought together developers, local government officials, housing charities, and financial institutions to create sustainable models for emergency housing. Our role wouldn't be to dictate policy, but to provide a neutral forum where different parties could work together toward practical solutions. And when these different parties have conflicting interests? When developers want maximum profits while housing advocates want maximum affordability, how do you navigate those conflicts without taking political positions? Catherine had thought about this challenge extensively. Your Majesty, I believe our role would be to focus everyone on shared outcomes rather than competing processes. Everyone can agree that children shouldn't sleep in cars, or that veterans shouldn't live on the streets. Our job would be to keep the conversation focused on achieving those outcomes rather than on the specific mechanisms for achieving them. The Queen stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens. Catherine could see her processing the conversation and weighing the implications of what they were discussing. When she turned back to Catherine, her expression was thoughtful rather than disapproving. Catherine, the Queen said, what you're proposing represents a significant evolution in the role of the monarchy. It would require careful planning, extensive consultation, and probably formal changes to how we approach our constitutional responsibilities. Catherine felt her heart leap with hope. The Queen wasn't rejecting her ideas outright. She was treating them as serious proposals worthy of consideration. Your Majesty, Catherine said, I understand that any changes would need to be gradual and carefully considered. but I believe that the monarchy's long-term relevance depends on our willingness to evolve with changing social needs and expectations. The Queen returned to her chair and looked directly at Catherine. Catherine, I want you to prepare a detailed proposal for how this approach might work in practice. I want you to address the constitutional questions, the political implications, and the practical challenges. I want you to consult with experts in housing policy, constitutional law, and public administration.
And I want you to be prepared to defend your ideas to the Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the other constitutional authorities whose support would be necessary for any significant changes.
Catherine felt a wave of amazement and gratitude.
The Queen was not only taking her ideas seriously, but was essentially commissioning her to develop them into a formal proposal for royal reform.
Your Majesty, Catherine said, does this mean that yesterday's actions at Stirling Street won't result in restrictions on my official duties?
Catherine, yesterday's actions at Stirling Street demonstrated that you have the courage to challenge established practices when you believe it's necessary to help people in need. That kind of moral courage is exactly what the monarchy needs as we face the challenges of the 21st century. Catherine felt tears of relief beginning to form in her eyes. Your Majesty, I'm grateful for your understanding and your willingness to consider new approaches. Catherine, the Queen said, standing to indicate that their formal conversation was concluding, I want you to remember that evolution and revolution are two very different things. What we're discussing is evolution, gradual, thoughtful, carefully planned change that strengthens the institution while allowing it to better serve the people. Revolution would be sudden, disruptive change that could damage or destroy the monarchy altogether. As Catherine prepared to leave, the Queen handed her a small envelope. Catherine, this is a personal note from me to the families at Stirling Street. I want them to know that their situation has not gone unnoticed by the Crown and that we are committed to working towards solutions that will help prevent other families from facing similar crises. Catherine accepted the envelope with deep gratitude, understanding that this gesture represented the Queen's blessing for her continued engagement with the Stirling Street families and her broader work on homelessness issues. And 3 months later, Catherine stood in the same conference room where she had first learnt about the Stirling Street crisis. But the scene was entirely different. The room was filled with representatives from major development companies, local government officials, housing charity leaders, and financial institution executives. They were gathered for the third meeting of the Royal Working Group on Emergency Housing, an initiative that had grown directly out of Catherine's confrontation with protocol and tradition.
Sarah Thompson was also present, no longer as someone facing eviction, but as a representative of families who had experienced homelessness.
She was there to ensure that the policy discussions remained grounded in real human experiences rather than abstract political theories.
The working group had already achieved concrete results. They had developed a new model for emergency housing that combined private investment, government support, and charitable partnerships. 3 pilot programs were operating in different cities, providing stable temporary housing for families in crisis while they worked toward permanent solutions. More importantly, the group had demonstrated that the royal family could play a constructive role in addressing complex social problems without abandoning constitutional principles or becoming partisan political actors. Catherine's approach had proven that evolution was possible, that the monarchy could adapt to modern needs while maintaining its unique position in British society. As Catherine looked around the room at the diverse group of people working together toward shared goals, she thought about little Emma Thompson's drawing that still hung on her office wall at Kensington Palace. The stick figures in the child's artwork had represented something profound, the simple truth that everyone deserved a safe place to live, and that sometimes the most important thing leaders could do was to remember their fundamental humanity. The Stirling Street crisis had ended with all 47 families finding stable housing within the 30-day extension that Catherine's intervention had secured. But more importantly, it had begun a process of institutional change that was making the monarchy more relevant, more engaged, and more effective as a force for positive change in British society. Catherine's defiant stand had proven that sometimes the most loyal thing you can do for an institution is to push it to become better than it was before.